Hey everyone, and welcome back to the 2023 Hack Summit. We're joined here by Manib Ali, who's the co-founder of Stacks, and he's here to teach us about Bitcoin Layer 2s and Ordinals. And Manib, it's a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for having me. So yeah, I'm Manib. I'm the co-creator of Stacks. It's an open source project, which is a Bitcoin layer, and it's a very decentralized ecosystem as well. And so today I'll walk you through some of the opportunity around building on Bitcoin, the excitement around Bitcoin layers, and especially Ordinals as well, which are these Bitcoin L1 NFTs. So let's get right in, I guess. So I think just as a background, I feel like Bitcoin has been around the longest in terms of like any cryptocurrency, but for one reason or the other, I feel like there is a lot more potential on Bitcoin that hasn't been unlocked yet, right? Like my personal feeling is that it mostly has to do with the lack of infrastructure, dev tooling, and the second element would have to be, there is some element of Bitcoin culture that sometimes might not be as welcoming to developers as it can. But still, even in today's sort of like bearish market, it's still $500 billion of capital, and that's the largest kind of like pool of crypto capital available out there. It is the chain that has stood the test of time. It's the most durable thing out there. So when people think about, what's the cryptocurrency that'll be around 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, I think the probability that's going to be Bitcoin is a lot more than anything else. So with that in mind, thinking about Bitcoin as the most durable thing, the most secure chain out there, there's a very interesting opportunity that what can be done in terms of building applications on top or effectively unlocking that large amount of capital that is sort of like stuck at the Bitcoin L1 layer, because you don't have smart contracts at Bitcoin L1. You can't really do much with it. Right? So that's kind of like the high level background. We'll explore what are the things that can be done to unlock that capital to build more applications on Bitcoin. And I think, secondly, we'll sort of like go over a overview of what's going on in Bitcoin right now. Right? Like there are various projects that are actually that are actually doing a bunch of interesting things, and we'll basically try to get an overview of that. So I think at a high level, I would say Bitcoin is on its way of becoming hard money. It's a store of value. But the thing that is sort of like underappreciated right now is that it's also a settlement layer, meaning you can build a bunch of different layers on top of Bitcoin, and on transactions from all those layers can actually settle on Bitcoin and in a very secure way. And that's a great way of actually building applications. So these days, let me rewind back a little bit that this idea of building on Bitcoin has been around for a while and has been criticized, and I would say like rightly so, right? Like a lot of people out there, they have basically had this criticism that if building on Bitcoin was so easy or so straightforward or such a great opportunity, why haven't we seen so many applications built on Bitcoin yet? And I think the answer to that is really that Bitcoin is limited by design, right? Like it's very simple by design. It is limited by design at the L1 layer. And there are more challenges that you need to overcome in terms of building Bitcoin layers, in terms of enabling people to like more easily build with Bitcoin. If you compare this to Ethereum, Ethereum has fully expressive smart contracts right at the L1, which actually in many ways makes the life of developers really easy. And they make a different trade-off, right? Like it's more complex at the L1 compared to Bitcoin, which is much more simple, can be much more durable, but it makes Ethereum makes life easy for developers. So interestingly, that criticism stayed there for several years, and then Ordinals happened, right? So if you're not familiar with what Ordinals are, just a few months ago, they're sort of like a byproduct of Taproot. Taproot is this upgrade that happened in Bitcoin almost like more than a year ago at this point. And Taproot was mostly a privacy and efficiency type of an upgrade, right? Like it makes data storage on Bitcoin much more efficient. And ordinals are you should look up like ordinals theory on ordinals.com. It's like a fascinating idea that you can actually try to number the smallest unit of Bitcoin called satoshis, and it's almost like a lens you can take on what the satoshis kind of like look like on the Bitcoin L1. And then you can sequence them. You can actually classify them into certain more rare satoshis and so on. And then you can inscribe data using a particular satoshi, right? And effectively, what happens with that is that you can actually store an entire image on the Bitcoin L1 itself. And when that happened, it was sort of like an aha moment in not just in the Bitcoin world, but in the broader crypto industry in general. And the idea that you could actually put a large file, or, these could be a couple of MB as well, directly on the Bitcoin blockchain was a big aha moment. Because typically that's not how NFTs are stored, right? Like most of the NFTs on Ethereum, they have pointers going to IPFS or some sort of a different storage. There are some NFTs that actually do store the data on the Ethereum L1 as well, but that's not the norm. Right? Those are pretty much like a small subset of that. And on Bitcoin, that was kind of like became through Ordinals, that became like the default way. And people had this aha moment that my image or my file is now indestructible, just like Bitcoin is indestructible. Right? So as soon as you inscribe something, inscribe your NFT or image, or could be text, could be anything on Bitcoin, suddenly you get this feeling that this thing is likely going to be there forever. Right? Like you might die, but your creation, your NFT is actually going to live there. And that had a very, very interesting impact on the Bitcoin fee market. Right? I personally think that Bitcoin block space was undervalued for a very long time. And with Ordinals, what started happening is that there's more demand for Bitcoin block space, right? Like people and these Ordinals NFTs just sort of like took off, right? Like I think by now more than 600,000 or so of them have been inscribed just in the past 8 to 12 weeks or so. And the interesting thing that happened was that it also attracted a lot of developers to Bitcoin. Like it revived kind of like interest of existing developers in the Bitcoin ecosystem, but a lot of people who were building in other ecosystems like Solana, Ethereum, others, they got interested and they came and actually started building more tools, which is really good for the Bitcoin economy because people are now building better wallets, they're building better explorers, they're building better libraries that can be used. And in a way, the market demand for these Bitcoin NFTs is actually driving a lot of innovation and a lot of excitement. So one thing that happened in this image that's kind of like on the slide right now is that Bitcoin for the first time is now having almost like a mempool issue, right? That hasn't happened for years in Bitcoin, where fees are going up. They've already gone up like 10 to 15x, and they might do another 10x. And what that does is that suddenly Bitcoin layers that are there for both for scalability, but also for providing new types of features around Bitcoin. They go from a nice to have to a medicine for a pain, right? Like if just like whenever on Ethereum gas fees go up, people want to go to L2s or people want to go to other faster L1s. And on Bitcoin, for the first time, like that's happening, that Bitcoin fees are going up, and now there's much more demand for these Bitcoin layers, which is the work that sort of like we've been doing for a while. So let me give you like just a high level overview of Bitcoin layers. Before I get into it, like I take a very, very broad definition of the word Bitcoin layer. For me, like anyone who's sort of like building on Bitcoin, and there are all sorts of different ways of doing that, right? Like they can be classified as a Bitcoin layer. So for me, a Bitcoin layer is a very broad term, and then we can narrow down and see how to differentiate between these things. And one thing that happens is that in the Ethereum world, there's a very specific technical definition of what a L2 is, right? In the Bitcoin world, I think people use the term L2 much more loosely, right? Like people would call Lightning an L2, they would call Liquid a L2, whereas Liquid is sort of like a federation, sort of like a separate network from Bitcoin. Folks who are in Ethereum wouldn't view it as a L2 and so on, but I think for our purposes, let's just use the more broad definition, because I think all of these projects are building on Bitcoin in one way or the other. So the key difference between Ethereum L2s, like quote unquote true L2s on Ethereum, and Bitcoin L2s is effectively Bitcoin doesn't have certain opcodes where you can move your BTC into a Bitcoin layer, but when you want to move it back, Bitcoin doesn't have the opcodes where you can enforce the security of that peg out from the layer back into Bitcoin to be fully secured by Bitcoin L1, fully enforced by Bitcoin L1, right? But it's actually not that big of a change. I think Bitcoin changes slowly, but in the coming 4 or 5 years or something like that, I'm pretty confident that those opcodes can be implemented. Bitcoin can evolve over time. But once you get those opcodes, then theoretically, there's like no difference between Ethereum L2 and a Bitcoin L2. But as of what Bitcoin looks like today, there is a difference between ETH L2s and Bitcoin L2s, and we'll sort of like get into it. So Lightning is a Bitcoin layer that is mostly focused on payments. It's a peer-to-peer network. It doesn't have like a full execution environment. You can't do like full smart contracts, but it is extremely fast, extremely cheap, and mostly focused on payments. The other layers like RSK and Liquid, they have some smart contract functionality. RSK is actually, it supports Ethereum virtual machine, and they both have a federated way of moving Bitcoin from the L1 into the Bitcoin layer and then back. So you're sort of like trusting the federation, right? And that's sort of like the model there is. It's not ideal, but it's sort of like practical. If you feel comfortable trusting the federation, you can use it. And then Stacks is a sort of like a unique Bitcoin layer. I think Stacks, in my view, comes closer to being a L2. Like Lightning is more of a pure L2 because you're only looking at the security of the L1 for getting your Bitcoin out. And Stacks does not have that property. But at Stacks, like we're working on this decentralized signing mechanism. So it's kind of like the theoretical best thing that you can do without actually modifying Bitcoin and introducing those opcodes, right? So there is a set of decentralized set of signers. They lock capital in Stacks consensus, and then they are the party that can actually bring the BTC back to the L1. Right? So again, there's a difference between that and how L2s work on Ethereum. But from a purely commercial or practical perspective, this is a great solution for the coming years until Bitcoin can actually change and you can have those opcodes at the Bitcoin layer. But once you get BTC in Stacks, then it is fully programmable. And I think that's the beauty of it. And I think the project has been getting more attention recently, but I still think we're at a very, very, very early stage right now because most people haven't really discovered what programmable Bitcoin really means. And I think the bulk of BTC, it basically is just passive. It's just sitting there at the L1 and is not really being used. So in terms of what Stacks is, there's a system that's like live today. The mainnet launch happened early 2021, and there's a major release that's currently being worked on, which is called the Nakamoto release. So the decentralized peg that I was talking about, that is actually going live with the Nakamoto release, which is planned later this year. And another big thing that's happening with the Nakamoto release is that Stacks layer will start using 100% of the Bitcoin hash power for security, meaning that if you want to reorg a transaction on Stacks, you actually have to go and reorg Bitcoin, which is, I think, a really, really kind of like nice property to have. And if you try using Stacks today, you will notice that the UX is not ideal because it runs at the speed of Bitcoin blocks, because Stacks is actually packaging all of the transactions that happen on the Stacks layer into a Bitcoin block to benefit from Bitcoin security. But that also means that if a Bitcoin block comes every 10 minutes, 30 minutes, you're sort of like waiting for Bitcoin blocks. And in this day and age, where most of the users kind of like are used to like a few seconds of transaction times, we fully understand, the developers in the ecosystem that this is not ideal. And that's why in the next release, the Nakamoto release, there's a very, very interesting cryptographic proof for passage of time in between Bitcoin blocks. What that means is that stacks will be able to tell that time is passing or prove that time is passing in between Bitcoin blocks. And you can actually do much faster blocks every few seconds after a Bitcoin block comes. And whenever the next Bitcoin block comes, all the fast blocks that happen in the middle, they can all settle on Bitcoin as well and benefit from the security. So I think in general, what that means is that if you try using stacks today, it might be slow. You might not actually fully experience like moving BTC from L1 into the L2, but it's getting there, right? Like there is a lot of excitement. There are a lot of developers, and I think once the Nakamoto release goes live, in my view personally, I think that's when real Bitcoin DeFi has a shot. To me, it seems like just like Ordinals kind of like sparked interest on Bitcoin NFTs. Obviously, these NFTs are on L1, and not everything can be on L1. I think the long tail of NFTs are likely going to end up on L2s as well. But on the Bitcoin DeFi side, we haven't had that moment yet. And I think the Nakamoto release launch, especially with SBDC, the asset where you can just easily go from L1 to L2 and back, I think that might actually be that spark where we start seeing a ton of innovation around Bitcoin DeFi, decentralized lending, decentralized exchanges around Bitcoin, or other privacy solutions around Bitcoin. That's the thing that at least I'm the most excited about later this year. All right. So I think one thing I want to comment on a little bit is that one really interesting and nice aspect of Ordinals has been that they're sort of like making Bitcoin fun again, right? Like if you notice, like in the last couple of years, a lot of the developer community was mostly sort of like not paying attention to Bitcoin. Or even a lot of the new users were playing around with NFTs or sort of like having fun, and these communities are forming. They're forming elsewhere, and Bitcoin community was sort of like becoming like very much focused on the monetary aspect of Bitcoin, like hard money enthusiasts, people who are mostly interested in using Bitcoin as a saving tool, which is great. I think that's a big use case of Bitcoin. But I've been in the Bitcoin ecosystem for around 10 years now, and I sort of like missed the early days, like between 2013 and 2016, when a lot more developers were around, a lot of like intellectually curious people were there, different experiments were happening, and I think I was sort of like missing that culture. And very interestingly, with the recent rise of both Ordinals and these Bitcoin layers, a lot of that culture is coming back, which I highly appreciate. It's like Bitcoin is becoming fun again. There are a bunch of these NFT communities that are extremely active in Bitcoin now. There are all these developers who are coming in and really shipping really fast. There's this culture of excitement and people doing hackathons and actually talking about intellectually interesting things like roll-ups on Bitcoin and whatnot. And I think that culture shift to me might actually be more important than anything else, because I think once you have that sort of a culture, then it starts to kind of like build upon itself from there and so on. Yeah, so I think I would encourage people who want to experience Ordinals to go check out Gamma.io. That's a NFT marketplace. They actually support NFTs both on L1, Bitcoin L1, and on the stacks there. And you can download a wallet like Xverse or Hero. Again, both these wallets, they support Bitcoin L1, but also layers like stacks as well, which means that I think that's a really nice web experience. Think of these as like MetaMask or Bitcoin L1 or L2. So I think having that experience of actually using or inscribing an NFT on Bitcoin L1, or trading a NFT on Bitcoin L1, or doing some sort of a DeFi protocol, like for example, there's this way of earning Bitcoin yield on stacks that a lot of people participate in. Something like $500 million of capital is locked in that. I think when people experience that, they actually have a very different kind of like experience of Bitcoin than what people have been having in the last 10 years. Because in the last 10 years, you would usually have some sort of a desktop wallet like Electrum, and the only thing you can really do there is either hold Bitcoin or just transfer it. Right? You can't really do anything else. But with these new web wallets, with these new Bitcoin layers and Ordinals, it's almost looking like anything you can do on a wallet on Solana or Ethereum, you can do those things on Bitcoin. Obviously, this ecosystem is early. Not like all of those different applications are there yet, and the infrastructure is still getting there. But it's a huge difference, almost like night and day, between the old school wallets like Electrum and almost having no feature, and over here, like having really good UX, a very kind of like smooth experience, and then doing fun things as well, and not just kind of like holding Bitcoin in cold storage. Yeah, so one other thing I would point out is maybe on Twitter, people have noticed folks who have a .btc in their Twitter handle. I have it, so on Twitter I'm Muneeb @Muneeb, MUNEEB, and my display name is actually Muneeb.btc. And there's a very interesting backstory to this BNS, the Bitcoin naming system. It actually predates Ethereum. I actually directly worked on it back in the days on Bitcoin L1, and it started on Bitcoin L1 around 2015, and around 2017 there were probably, I would say, 100,000 or something like that domains registered on it, and we clearly experienced that scalability issues at Bitcoin L1, and it was fairly clear that these things can't scale at L1, and that's how actually the need for the Stacks layer started, and then the Stacks project started later on in 2017 and became its own thing. But this BNS system is still around. It actually migrated when Stacks launched in 2021. It migrated from L1 to L2, and some of those names that were sort of like registered early on, they're still around, right? So in some ways, these domain names are kind of like early NFTs, just like NFTs started on Bitcoin with Counterparty. Domain names also started on Bitcoin with BNS. So I think a lot of people are pretty excited about it because similar to NFTs, the provenance matters. I think having a very rich history matters. And similar to NFTs, people sort of like intuitively can tell that if something is registered on Bitcoin or is secured on Bitcoin, it's much more durable. It's going to be around for a while. So we've seen a bunch of interest in developers building interesting tools for BNS, all sorts of like new extensions, new features, and new types of registrars are coming up. So definitely check it out if you're interested in NFTs, because they're really nice and they're really nice kind of like additional thing with a very rich history on Bitcoin. Yeah, with that, I think the main takeaway of my talk today is that the Bitcoin developer ecosystem was sort of like small, and not a lot of what's happening there in the past, I would say 3-4 years, and it was criticized. Like a lot of people would criticize Bitcoin that you can't do much with Bitcoin. Maybe Bitcoin would become less relevant for developers, and that has just drastically changed this year. So if there's one takeaway you can have, it would be that if you're a developer, you should try and play around with things that are coming up in Bitcoin now, because it's almost like a very early market, right? Bitcoin NFTs are at a much earlier stage with Ordinals than NFTs on Ethereum or even Solana and so on, which means that if you want to be early somewhere, if you get excited by being early, you're going to come and build some of the core infrastructure, be an early part of the community, and even if you're a startup founder and you're looking for new opportunities, the Bitcoin opportunity might be one of the biggest ones that is just like hiding in plain sight, right? Like because there's like $500 billion of capital literally sitting there. Not a lot of developers currently working on it, although that's changing rapidly. More and more people are coming in. And I think it's a very contrarian type of a thing where people aren't paying a lot of attention. But once they realize that, hey, Bitcoin can easily be made programmable through SBDC or the other Nakamoto release work that's happening later this year, then it almost becomes like a thing that is crystal clear in the rear view mirror. Right? Like a year from now, when people will look back and they were like, of course, Bitcoin was going to become programmable to Bitcoin L2s and so on. Of course, there was going to be like a large economy around Bitcoin because Bitcoin is the biggest asset. But right now, not everyone thinks that way, right? So there is that moment of opportunity, especially if you're a developer and you want to come in and be the person who's actually building kind of like the next Uniswap on Bitcoin or the next OpenSea on Bitcoin. I would say right now is that time. So with that, like I want to leave you with some helpful links. As I said, I'm at Munib on Twitter. Trust Machines is my company that is building applications and contributing to infrastructure. You can find us on Trust Machines Co. Stacks is the open source project, a Bitcoin layer. You can find it on @Stacks, and on GitHub, it's Stacks. Thank you so much.
Munib, thank you so much. That's a great presentation. I'm going to go ahead and bring you on stage so we can take one quick question from you. By the way, fascinating talk. It's really interesting how you can, all the applicability of Bitcoin. And a lot of folks don't think of Bitcoin that way today. They think of it more of as a store of value, but you can actually do a lot more with it. I actually think there's a lot of advantages of using Bitcoin for more than just being a store of value, because there's one hypothesis that's running around right now, which is that Bitcoin is probably, it's probably pretty necessary for Bitcoin to do well, for the rest of the altcoins to do well, because they tend to be correlated to the price of Bitcoin, right? So if Bitcoin completely fails, it's probably going to be bad news for the altcoins, right? So you kind of have to bet on Bitcoin no matter what, whether you're betting on any of these altcoins, right? So given that, Bitcoin's probably a pretty reasonable store of value, compared to some of these altcoins, right? And so if that's the case, then there's high product market fit for Bitcoin. We know that people will be using it and holding it, right? So why not do something with it, right? So it seems like it's like a kind of a safe horse to bet on from a, let's do something more with it than just have it be a store of value. So that's why I'm particularly interested in this.
Yeah, I absolutely. Go ahead.
So the question, what are the pros and cons? Like if we were to build applications on Bitcoin, are there performance considerations? Are there latency considerations, cost considerations versus competing platforms? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is what I touched upon in my presentation a little bit, that Ethereum was designed to be programmable at the L1 layer, and Bitcoin was not. But even on Ethereum, most of the action is now moving to L2s. Right? Like we know that most of the applications will be built on L2s. We know that most of the users will actually be using L2s like in the future. And I think a similar future holds for Bitcoin as well, but these L2s in Bitcoin aren't as developed yet as some of the Ethereum ones, right? So if you look at Arbitrum, if you look at Optimism, and then some of the other ones that are coming up, like it's a much bigger market, around 200 something billion dollars for Ethereum, and then 50-60 billion dollars for the L2 market. On the Bitcoin side, $500 billion for Bitcoin L1, which is very simple, very limited. You can't do much with it. And only like $1.5 billion for Bitcoin layers right now. Right, so it's actually a relatively early stage thing, Bitcoin layers. And I think as they become more mature, like projects like Stacks or RSK and new ones, like there are a bunch of these Bitcoin roll-up companies that are starting as well. And I see them all as Bitcoin layers that can come and make this vision possible. I think as they mature, then it will become easier for developers to come and build on Bitcoin as well, right? Like some of these performance issues get ironed out, where I do think it's a huge pain if you're a user or a developer and you have to wait like 10 minutes for a Bitcoin block, where on Ethereum in a few seconds, like transaction goes through. I think it might seem like a small thing. It's actually a pretty big thing, right? So when things like that get ironed out, the quality of like developer tools goes up, which is already happening. I'm not worried about that. I think that can be a major unlock.
And one last question. This is more of a regulatory question, but I'm just fascinated by your journey at Stacks. So my understanding is that originally you worked very closely with the SEC and received the first ever kind of token offering that received approval from the SEC, which is phenomenal. I hadn't heard of other projects that actually collaborated with the SEC, and that was very forward thinking of you. And that was back in 2019. And then later on, you kind of recontemplated that decision and decided to deem yourself to be a utility token and not to be a security anymore. And I was wondering like how you accomplished this, and what is the utility of the Stacks token, and also can other projects learn from this, and what should be the takeaway point from this journey?
Yeah. So I think you're right. I'll just make one correction that even in our offering in 2019, and this offering is public, people can go and read it. We basically told the regulators that this is a utility token, and the network is going to decentralize at some point. And we actually laid out some of the early steps for the decentralization as well. So I do think like we spent a fair amount of time kind of like trying to do things the right way. So effectively think of it this way, that there is the offering, which was qualified, meaning that it's fully legal for anyone, including the US general public, to participate in the offering, purchase the tokens, and so on. And the original company that was doing the R&D and kind of like did the offering basically kept complying with the SEC filing requirements and so on for years and years to come, like off of that. And then there's that explicit time of like mainnet launch, right, where the project sort of like explicitly decentralized. And we talked about that decentralization even in the original offering, but later on as well, where a legal framework came out through Wilson Sonsini, where we basically said, here's our decentralization framework. The original company behind it, that was kind of like an R&D lab. It's still around in a different form, but for all practical purposes, it was sort of like dismantled, right? Like all the early team members, including myself, they kind of like went off, did other things. So one really good thing about Stacks is it's not a decentralized and name-only type of a product. It's actually decentralized, right? Like everyone sort of like went off in their own directions. People, whatever they're passionate about, they're working on it. And there is no central company that people sort of like rely on. Sometimes it is challenging as well. There's overhead because we had to learn like over last year and so on, how to work together as like 30 plus entities and many open source contributors. How do we even collaborate in an open source project and truly move the project forward in a decentralized way? And it's a lot of overhead. It's a lot of work. You have to like learn these things. And but the long-term benefit is that this is something that's actually decentralized. Right? So there isn't a company that disappears and suddenly the project might be in trouble, which I think is a very, very helpful thing. And it goes with the ethos of Bitcoin as well. In terms of lessons for other people, I think our original offering, the public kind of like news about this as well. It was very expensive. We were able to afford it, but I'm not sure if most of the product can. And it was very lengthy. It was a lot of overhead. I'm glad we did it, because especially now in this environment when regulators are just like coming down and everything, at least we know that we took all the right steps from the beginning. Right, so it does give people like that reassurance, and there is a benefit to it. And I think it forced us to really decentralize. Like that's a benefit that I don't think people really realize, that because it was a qualified offering and because we had to really be careful about decentralization, there was a lot of added pressure on us to really, really decentralize. And I do think that that can also be healthy for projects where, instead of sort of like pretending, not like pretending, but like not being as decentralized as you can be, versus having this forcing function that really makes you a truly decentralized project. I think there are some benefits there as well.
Absolutely, it seems like great medicine, and without that constraint in there, it may have been longer for a gradual path to decentralization. So
that's true.
Fantastic. It's been a great talk, Manib. Thank you so much. Really, really interesting. Developers, I hope you in the audience take Manib's offer up and learn about programming on Bitcoin and extending Bitcoin for many more use cases. And I hope you check out the Stacks product portfolio as well. And Manib, thanks again for joining us today. It's a pleasure having you today.
Thanks for having me. Take care.